There is something they never told you. Not your parents, not your teachers, not the system that shaped you from the moment you were old enough to be shaped. They gave you rules, they gave you religion, they gave you the comfortable lie that if you are good enough, kind enough, patient enough, the world will reward you. And you believed it. Of course you believed it. You were a child. Children believe what they are handed. But you are not a child anymore. And somewhere in the architecture of your life, between the relationships that drained you, and the silences that swallowed you, and the moments where you held your tongue when you should have spoken and spoke when you should have walked away, somewhere in all of that wreckage, a question has been forming. Slowly, quietly, like a wound that never quite closes. Why do the ruthless ones win? Not sometimes, not occasionally, but consistently, reliably, with a pattern so undeniable it begins to feel like gravity. The man who takes what he wants, who does not apologize for his presence, who never explains himself, he advances. The woman who does not bend, who does not plead, who refuses to shrink herself into shapes that please other people, she commands. And you who tried to be fair, who tried to be reasonable, who tried to play the game by the rules they taught you, you are still waiting, still explaining yourself, still wondering why you feel invisible in rooms full of people who see right through you. This is not an accident. This is by design. And tonight, we dismantle the design, not to make you cruel, not to make you cold, but to show you the truth that Friedrich Nietzsche spent his entire life screaming into the void. A truth so dangerous that civilization has spent a century trying to bury it beneath theology, psychology, and self-help platitudes. The truth is this: most of what you were taught about strength is a lie constructed by the weak to control the strong. And until you understand that, really understand it, not intellectually, not as a concept you can nod at, but as a visceral recognition that rewires something deep in your nervous system, you will keep losing to people who have already understood it. So breathe, because what comes next is not comfortable. What comes next is necessary. Before we can talk about power, we have to talk about what was done to you. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and one of his most profound discoveries was something he called the persona, the mask. The carefully constructed social face that each of us builds to survive in the world. Now, the persona is not inherently a problem. Every human being needs a social interface. You cannot live entirely in your raw, unfiltered interior self and function in society. The problem is what happens when the mask becomes the man. When you can no longer tell where the performance ends and the person begins. Think about the version of yourself that you present to the world. The agreeable one. The one that softens its edges in difficult conversations. The one that laughs at the right moments, defers at the right moments, shrinks at the right moments. When did you build that version? In most cases, you built it in childhood, under pressure, under the weight of disapproval and abandonment and punishment. You learned, with terrifying efficiency, which version of yourself was safe to show, and which parts needed to be hidden. The anger, hide it. The desire, suppress it. The refusal to be diminished, swallow it. And here is what no one warned you about. Every piece of yourself you buried to survive didn't disappear. It just went underground. It became what Jung called the shadow, the dark repository of everything you denied, every impulse you were told was wrong, every wild, untamed part of yourself that the civilizing machine couldn't accommodate. The shadow doesn't die, it waits. And while it waits, the mask you built in its place, that agreeable, apologetic, over-explaining, permission-seeking persona, that mask became your prison. You move through life wondering why you feel hollow, why approval feels like it should satisfy you but doesn't, why you keep finding yourself in relationships and situations where your needs are perpetually secondary, why you feel despite all evidence of your competence, like you are always on the edge of being found out, found wanting, found insufficient. That feeling has a name. It is the feeling of a person who has abandoned themselves so thoroughly that they no longer know who they abandoned. Nietzsche saw this. He saw it everywhere around him in the culture of his time, and he named it with a fury that made the comfortable profoundly uncomfortable. He called it slave morality, the value system of those who have no power, and so construct an ethics that makes powerlessness virtuous. That makes submission holy. That reframes weakness as humility and resentment as righteousness, and the inability to act as spiritual enlightenment. He was not describing evil people. He was describing something far more disturbing. People who had been so thoroughly broken that they had learned to love their own chains. And then, and this is the part that should stop you cold, they had built a civilization-wide system to ensure that everyone else wore them too. You were handed those chains at birth, and you have been calling them your conscience. Let us slow down here, because this requires precision. When Nietzsche wrote about power, when he ripped apart the comfortable moral frameworks of his era, he was not advocating for cruelty. He was not writing a manual for sociopaths. He was performing a kind of philosophical surgery, cutting away the infection so the body could finally see clearly. The infection was this: the confusion between genuine ethics and the weaponized humility of those who use morality as a tool of control. Think about the people who have drained you in your life. Not the obvious ones, not the loud, aggressive, visibly threatening ones. Those ones are easy to identify. I mean the subtle ones, the ones who made you feel guilty for having needs. The ones who weaponize their own suffering to keep you compliant. The ones who called your boundaries selfishness, and your strength arrogance, and your refusal to collapse cruelty. Those people were not operating from some higher moral plane. They were operating from projection, one of the most powerful mechanisms in the entire architecture of human psychology. Jung's concept of projection is brutal in its elegance. What we cannot face in ourselves, we see in others. What we refuse to acknowledge about our own psychology, we exile outward. We see it reflected, magnified, and threatening in the people around us. The person who cannot tolerate their own hunger for power will call you power-hungry for having a spine. The person who is terrified of their own anger will pathologize yours. The person who has surrendered their own autonomy will call your independence coldness. This is not coincidence. This is psychic mechanics. And the reason understanding this matters, the reason this is not just intellectual philosophy but a survival skill, is that until you can see projection for what it is, you will keep absorbing it. You will keep taking on the psychological burdens that belong to other people. You will keep doubting yourself in the presence of people whose doubt about themselves is so intolerable that they need to project it onto you. The ruthless ones, the ones who seem to win while you struggle, many of them have, consciously or not, stopped absorbing projection. They stopped taking the bait. They refused, somewhere along the line, to participate in the theater where other people's shadows got to write the script of their identity. That refusal looked ruthless from the outside. From the inside, it was just clarity. Now, here is where it becomes more complex. Because not everyone who wins does so from clarity. Not everyone who appears powerful is psychologically healthy. Some of the most visibly dominant people in the world are operating from their own unexamined shadow, from wounds so deep and so unintegrated that the only way they know how to manage the pain is to dominate everything in their vicinity. This is not strength. This is a different kind of slavery, a slavery to the shadow, a compulsive cruelty that mirrors the compulsive submission it mirrors. True power, and this is what Nietzsche was pointing toward, though the world has spent a century misreading him. True power is not domination of others. It is sovereignty over oneself. It is the will to power directed inward, toward self-mastery, toward the ruthless honesty of confronting every comfortable lie you have ever told yourself, toward the refusal to let your wounds become your entire personality. That is the power no one can take from you. And that is the power almost no one develops. You have been bleeding for years, and you thought it was just life. You have been giving and giving and giving your attention, your energy, your explanations, your justifications, your emotional labor, and then wondering why you feel empty. Why the tiredness is not just in your body, but in something deeper than your body. Why sleep doesn't fully restore you anymore. Jung understood the psyche as an energy system, not metaphorically, structurally. Your psychological vitality is a finite resource, and it obeys something like the laws of thermodynamics. Energy that flows out into one domain is energy unavailable for another. Every time you explain yourself to someone who has already decided not to understand you, energy out. Every time you manage someone else's emotional state at the cost of your own, energy out. Every time you contort yourself to fit expectations that were never built to accommodate who you actually are, energy out. And the cruelest part is that this hemorrhage is largely invisible, because it happens in the small transactions, the unnecessary apologies, the shrinking before you've even entered the room, the reflexive deference that happens so fast, so automatically, that you barely register it as a choice. It is a choice. Or rather, it was once a choice. Now it is a conditioned reflex. And conditioned reflexes are not chosen. They were installed. The question is, now that you know they were installed, will you choose to keep running them? Nietzsche had a concept he called ressentiment, a French word he used deliberately because it carried a particular flavor of corrosive, impotent, festering resentment. The resentment of those who cannot act, who cannot transform their suffering into something generative, and so instead let it curdle into a quiet, smoldering hatred directed at everything that represents what they cannot be. Resentment is not anger. Anger is clean. Anger has direction. Anger can be transformed into action, into creation, into the energy that drives change. Resentment is anger that has gone toxic from being denied expression for too long. It is what happens to your psychic energy when you swallow your truth for years and years, when you keep performing the agreeable mask while something underneath rages and is never given a legitimate outlet. You know this feeling, that slow burn of being unseen, that particular exhaustion of being understood only through the distortion of someone else's projection, that quiet fury of watching less capable, less careful, less conscientious people advance past you because they simply refuse to feel guilty about wanting what they wanted. That is resentment. And here is what Nietzsche said about it that nobody wants to hear. Resentment is not a reaction to injustice. It is the consequence of a particular relationship to power, specifically the relationship of someone who has outsourced their power to external forces and then blamed those external forces for the resulting powerlessness. In other words, no one did this to you. Or more precisely, yes, people have done things to you, real things, painful things, unjust things. But the ongoing drain, the continuing hemorrhage of your psychic energy into systems and people and dynamics that do not serve you, that is not something happening to you. That is something you are participating in, and you can choose to stop. Here is the confrontation you have been avoiding. The ruthless people who win, the ones who have been living rent-free in your mind, who have been the silent referent in every moment you felt powerless. They are not entirely alien to you. Part of you recognizes them. Part of you is them. That part lives in your shadow. Jung mapped the shadow with a cartographer's precision and a poet's dread. He understood that the shadow is not simply the repository of your evil impulses. It contains everything that doesn't fit the persona you built to survive, which means it also contains your power, your ferocity, your ambition, your hunger, your capacity for absolute refusal. all of that was buried too, because the same childhood process that taught you to hide your anger also taught you to hide your strength. The same social conditioning that made your neediness shameful also made your sovereignty suspicious. The same system that told you aggression was wrong also pathologized your will, so you buried all of it together. The destructive and the generative, the wound and the medicine, the darkness and the ferocity that could have protected you from being wounded in the first place. The person who never stops explaining themselves, and by now you know who I'm talking about because you've seen them in these words, that person is not just weak in the conventional sense. They are disconnected from their own shadow. They have never claimed the parts of themselves that would make them dangerous. That would make them unpredictable. That would make them capable of walking away. And so they explain, and explain, and explain, because explanation is the only tool available to someone who has surrendered the rest of the toolkit. Shadow integration, what Jung called bringing the shadow into conscious relationship, is not about becoming cruel. It is about becoming whole. It is about reclaiming the ferocity you buried so that you can choose when and whether to deploy it, rather than living in terror of it. Because here is the terrible irony. The people who fear their own darkness the most are precisely the ones most likely to have it erupt uncontrollably. The shadow does not stay buried forever. It surfaces in rage that seems disproportionate, in passive aggression that poisons relationships, in the subtle sabotage of the very things you claim to want. The integrated person, the one who has looked into their own darkness and said, I see you, and I am not afraid of what you are, and I will not let you run me from underground. That person is genuinely dangerous, not to others in any gratuitous sense, but dangerous in the way that a person who knows their own capacity for violence is dangerous. They do not need to use it, because the knowledge of it is already present in every interaction, in the quality of their stillness, in the steadiness of their gaze. You cannot manipulate someone who has claimed their own capacity for ruthlessness. You cannot guilt someone who has faced their shadow and made peace with it. You cannot shake someone who has descended into their own darkness and returned with fire. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote that one must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The dancing star is not despite the chaos, it is because of it. There is a particular kind of person who enters a room and without saying a word, without performing, without announcing, without demanding attention, changes the atmospheric pressure of the space. You have felt this. You know what I'm describing. It is not charisma in the conventional sense. It is not charm. Charm is something you deploy. What this person has is something more fundamental, a kind of energetic density that comes from having no leaks. They are not hemorrhaging energy into the management of other people's perceptions of them. They are not scanning the room for approval. They are not constructing explanations in real time for why they deserve to be there. They have simply chosen to be there. Or not, with equal ease. This is what conscious withdrawal produces. Not the withdrawal of the wounded, the hurt retreat, the passive-aggressive disappearance, the silence that screams, notice me, chase me, prove that I matter. That is not power. That is pain wearing power's clothing. Conscious withdrawal is different in its very essence. It arises from a person who has done enough interior work that they no longer need the validation of external presence, who has integrated enough of their shadow that they are comfortable being unknown, being misread, being in the company of their own interior life without panic. Jung observed something profound about what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, distinct from the collective, distinct from the persona, rooted in the self. He noticed that this process often involves periods of deliberate withdrawal, not escape, not avoidance, but a kind of necessary turning inward, a withdrawal of energy from external performance, so that it can be redirected toward genuine self-construction. The culture we live in has pathologized this. We live in an era of aggressive presence, of performative availability, of the notification that must be answered immediately, and the silence that is read as passive aggression, and the person who does not respond within the hour being treated as a social transgressor. This culture serves the weak. It is designed by and for people who need perpetual external stimulation to avoid confronting the interior life they haven't built. The person who can be silent, genuinely silent, not as a tactic in someone else's game but as a natural expression of their relationship to their own interior. That person is operating at a frequency that most of the culture cannot match. And the ruthless ones win partly because they have, consciously or not, protected their psychic energy from the drain of performative availability. They do not answer every call because every call does not deserve an answer. They do not explain every choice because every choice does not require explanation. They do not chase because chasing reveals the most important information of any negotiation. That you need the outcome more than the other party does. The one who needs nothing, or more precisely, the one who cannot be made to feel that they need something by external manipulation, holds all the cards in every interaction. Not because they are cold, not because they do not care, but because their caring has direction. It is not broadcast indiscriminately. It does not flow toward anyone who demands it simply by demanding it. It is reserved, selective, given only to what has earned it. This selectivity is what other people feel as power, and it begins, always, with the cultivation of an interior life so rich that external performance begins to feel not just unnecessary, but beneath you. Not in the hierarchical sense, in the energetic sense, like you are simply playing a different game. Let us return to Nietzsche, because the world has been getting him wrong for a century, and it is time to get him right. The will to power. Mention those words in most contexts and watch the room tighten. People hear domination. They hear the justification of exploitation. They hear the philosophical scaffolding that was crudely weaponized by ideologues who needed a dead genius to legitimize their appetites. But Nietzsche's concept was never primarily about domination of others. It was about the overcoming of oneself. The will to power, der Wille zur Macht, is the fundamental creative drive that Nietzsche saw as the core of all life. Not the drive to survive, as the Darwinians would have it. Not the drive to reproduce, not even the drive to be happy, but the drive to become, to grow, to surpass, to transcend the current form and emerge into a more expanded expression of what one is. This drive is amoral in the sense that it does not conform to conventional social ethics, but it is not anti-moral. It is beyond conventional morality in the specific sense that it refuses to let external moral frameworks override the internal imperative to become. The person who stifles their growth to avoid making others uncomfortable is not moral. They are cowardly. They have confused social compliance with virtue, and they are paying for that confusion with their entire life. The person who allows their potential to be managed and diminished by the expectations of people who are threatened by it, that person is not humble. They are complicit in their own diminishment. And Nietzsche's most radical claim, the one that still has the power to destabilize everything if you actually let it land, is that this complicity is not forced on you. You chose it, not consciously, not with full information, but at some level, you chose the known smallness over the unknown largeness. You chose the safety of being understood over the risk of becoming someone who operates beyond the categories in which other people have already filed you. This is the hard truth that hides inside the comfortable narrative of victimhood. Yes, the system shaped you. Yes, the conditioning was early and deep. Yes, the people who diminished you were real and their impact was real. And you still have a choice, right now, today, not about the past, The past is fixed, but about what you do with the psychological raw material that the past produced. Do you continue operating from the wounded persona, the over-explaining, permission-seeking, projection-absorbing, energy-hemorrhaging version of yourself that survival constructed? Or do you begin the terrifying, exhilarating, genuinely dangerous process of going underneath the persona to find out what is actually there? Because what is there is not what you fear. What is there is not a monster, not emptiness, not the confirmation of your worst suspicions about your own worthlessness. What is there is the self that was there before the conditioning, before the masking, before the years of being shaped by environments that were not built to accommodate your full expression. Jung called this the self, with a capital S, to distinguish it from the ego, the small self, the social self, the constructed self. The self is the totality of the psyche, the integrated wholeness that most people never encounter because they spend their entire lives at the surface, managing the persona, while the self waits in the depths. The ruthless ones who win, the ones who seem untouchable, who seem to operate from a different set of rules. At their best, they are touching that self. They have stumbled, often unconsciously, into a relationship with their own depth. They have stopped performing and started being. And being, genuinely being, without the performance, without the apology, without the perpetual self-justification, radiates something that the performing, apologizing, justifying self simply cannot produce. It radiates authority. Not the authority of rank or title or social position. The authority of someone who has looked into their own abyss and not flinched, who has faced their shadow and claimed it, who has descended into the hell of their own psychology and come back up with something real. That authority cannot be conferred by others. It cannot be taken away by others. It is built, slowly and painfully, in the furnace of self-confrontation. And it is the only kind of power that is actually power. Let us look at this with the coldest possible clarity. The reason you have been manipulated, and if you are honest with yourself, you have been probably more times than you have fully reckoned with, is not because you are stupid. It is not because you are weak in any essential sense. It is because you had a wound in a specific location, and the people who manipulate do what predators always do. They find the wound. What is the wound? Usually it is one of a small number of things. The terror of abandonment, the hunger for approval, the belief installed early and deep that your needs are too much, that your authentic self is fundamentally too large, too intense, too demanding to be loved without being managed, reduced, made palatable. These wounds are remarkably common, which makes sense. They are typically installed in childhood by caregivers who had the same wounds, passed down through generations in an unbroken chain of unconscious transmission. And what the manipulator does, what every emotionally predatory person does, usually without full awareness of their own mechanics, is identify this wound and use it as a lever. They threaten abandonment to create compliance. They withhold approval to create anxiety. They make your authentic self the problem, too sensitive, too intense, too much, and offer conditional acceptance contingent on your diminishment. And the wounded person, the person who never got the foundational experience of being fully seen and fully accepted, responds to this offer. Not because they want to be manipulated, but because conditional acceptance is better than the abandonment they fear most. Jung's concept of projection is relevant here in a devastating way. The manipulator is often projecting their own shadow onto you, their own disowned neediness, their own terror, their own insufficiency. They have found a way to externalize their interior warfare, and you, with your specific wound in that specific location, became the battlefield. And you absorbed it. You took on the projected shadow as if it were yours. You began to see yourself through the distortion of their projection. You started to believe that the version of you they needed to see, the manageable, containable, diminished version, was actually closer to the truth than the large, complex, self-determined version you had dimly felt yourself to be. This is the psychological mechanism behind almost every dynamic where a powerful person is systematically diminished by someone less capable. The less capable person is not winning through merit. They are winning through exploitation. Through the specific targeted activation of a wound that the more capable person never healed. Healing the wound does not mean the wound never happened. It means you stop carrying it where others can reach it. It means you do the interior work. And yes, it is work, real work, the kind that happens in silence and solitude, and often in the company of genuine pain. To know your own vulnerability so thoroughly that it can no longer be used against you by anyone who hasn't actually earned access to it. This is what the individuation process demands in Jungian terms. Not the elimination of vulnerability. That is not possible and not desirable. But the conscious, integrated relationship with your own vulnerability such that it becomes a source of depth rather than a point of exploitation. The person who knows their wound and has worked with it is infinitely less exploitable than the person who has suppressed the wound and forgotten where it is. Because suppression doesn't protect you. It just means you react without knowing why. It means the wound operates unconsciously below your awareness, doing its damage in the dark. Consciousness is the only protection. Painful, expensive, life-altering consciousness. Let us be precise about what ruthless winning actually looks like from the inside. It is not cruelty for its own sake. It is not the pleasure of hurting others. People who operate from that place are not powerful. They are compulsively destructive, which is a different and much smaller thing. What the genuinely powerful person has is this: a primary orientation toward themselves rather than toward the management of others' responses. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Most people's interior life, if you mapped it, would show a constant, low-grade surveillance of the social environment. The perpetual monitoring of others' reactions, the continuous micro-adjustment of behavior in response to perceived approval or disapproval, the ongoing calculation of what this person needs from me, what that person thinks of me, whether this expression is safe or whether that boundary will be punished. This surveillance consumes an enormous amount of psychic energy. Energy that is therefore unavailable for actual creation, actual vision, actual power. The ruthless person, or more accurately, the psychologically sovereign person, has, to a significant degree, withdrawn this surveillance. Not because they are oblivious to others, but because their primary reference point is internal. They ask, "What do I think?" Before they ask, "What will others think?" They ask, "What do I want?" Before they ask, "What are others expecting?" They ask, "Is this true for me?" Before they ask, "Will this be approved of?" This reorientation, from external to internal reference, is the single most significant psychological shift that separates the powerful from the merely performing. And it is available to anyone, but it costs something. What it costs is the willingness to be misunderstood, the willingness to be seen as cold when you are actually clear, to be seen as arrogant when you are actually grounded, to be seen as difficult when you are actually boundaried, to be seen as selfish when you are actually, for perhaps the first time, self-determining. The culture will pathologize this shift. The people who benefited from your old self, the available, apologetic, over-explaining self, will call the new self names. Let them. Because what they are reacting to is not actually cruelty. What they are reacting to is the withdrawal of their supply, the end of the dynamic where they got to be the author of your identity. And that reaction, that particular flavor of condemnation directed at people who simply refuse to be managed, is the clearest possible signal that you are doing something right. Nietzsche called this the transvaluation of values. The moment when you stop accepting the value system that was handed to you and begin, from within yourself, from the authority of your own lived experience and your own hard-won self-knowledge, to construct a set of values that are genuinely yours. This is not nihilism. This is not the rejection of all values. It is the rejection of inherited values that you have never actually chosen. Values that serve structures of power that are not yours, that keep you compliant in ways that benefit others at the cost of your own becoming. The person who has undergone this transvaluation does not look like what most people picture when they picture ruthless. They do not look cold. They do not look threatening. They do not look like the villain of the story. They look calm. They look present. They look, and this is the word that keeps arising, grounded, as if they have weight, as if they cannot be easily moved. Because they cannot. Not anymore. We need to talk about silence one more time, but differently. Not the silence of strategy. Not the silence of withholding. Not the silence that is really just loudness wearing different clothes. The silence that comes after the integration. When you have done the shadow work, when you have looked into the parts of yourself you are most afraid of and found them not monstrous, but simply human and yours, something changes in the quality of your quiet. It stops being the silence of someone suppressing something. It becomes the silence of someone who has nothing to suppress. This is the silence that Jung described as the precondition for genuine encounter with the self. Not the engineered silence of meditation techniques or productivity hacks. The natural silence that emerges when you stop performing, stop managing, stop running the constant background program of how am I being perceived. That silence has a quality to it that other people feel before they understand it. They call it presence. They call it authority. They call it, and this is the word that keeps coming up around people who have done this interior work, weight. The person has weight, not physical weight, psychological density, the density of someone whose interior is not hollow, who is not running on performance and approval seeking, who does not need the room to confirm their existence because they have already confirmed it, in the only place confirmation actually counts, from within. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the eternal recurrence, the thought experiment of imagining that your life, exactly as it is, would repeat itself infinitely, forever. That every moment you have lived would loop back and be lived again. He intended this not as metaphysics, but as a kind of existential test. The question behind the question was, could you affirm your life? Not just tolerate it, not just endure it, but genuinely, fully with everything included. The suffering, the failures, the choices you regret, the years you spent performing instead of being. Could you say yes to all of it? That affirmation, what he called amor fati, love of fate, is not resignation. It is not passive acceptance. It is the most radical possible act of self-possession. It is the declaration that everything that happened to you, everything you have done and failed to do and survived and built and lost, it is all yours. You own it. You claim it. You would choose it again. This is what the winning looks like from the inside. Not domination, not the satisfaction of watching others lose. The profound, quiet, almost unbearable dignity of a life that belongs entirely to the person living it. You are about to stop being manageable. If you let this land, really let it land, not as a concept but as a decision, you are about to become something that the people who have relied on your manageability are going to find deeply disorienting. And that disorientation is not your problem. Here is what changes. The relationships in your life will reorganize around your new center of gravity. Some will fall away. The ones that were built on the foundation of your availability, your endless patience, your willingness to absorb others' shadows. They will fall away not because you push them, but because you stopped feeding them. And relationships that aren't fed die. Let them die. because in the space they leave, something else can grow. Relationships built not on your wound and someone else's exploitation of it, but on genuine recognition. The recognition that comes when two people who have done interior work encounter each other, and neither of them needs to perform. Your relationship with your own desires will change. You will begin to notice what you actually want, not the managed, pre-apologized, already minimized version of wanting that you have been presenting to the world, but the raw, clear, unembarrassed desire that lives underneath the persona. And you will begin, perhaps for the first time, to move toward it. Not ruthlessly in the sense of without care, but ruthlessly in the sense of without apology. Without the preemptive guilt of wanting too much. Without the anticipatory shrinking that happens when you sense that what you want might make someone else uncomfortable. You will become, in the deepest sense of the word, sovereign. Not over others, never over others in the genuine Nietzschean sense, because the domination of others is a sign of insecurity, not power. But sovereign over yourself, over your attention, your energy, your response, your direction, your identity. This sovereignty is not arrogance, it is not coldness, it is not the aggressive performance of power that you see in people who are actually afraid. It is the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who knows who they are and has stopped asking for permission to be it. Jung called the endpoint of individuation the self, not as a destination you arrive at and plant a flag, but as an ongoing orientation. A way of moving through the world in relationship with your own totality, with your light and your shadow, integrated into something functional and genuine. The person who has begun this process does not look like what most people imagine when they imagine powerful. They often look quiet. They often look still. They often look from the outside like they are simply moving through the world with an ease that seems almost offensive given how hard everyone else is working. But the ease is earned. It is the ease that comes after the hardest work any human being can do, the work of facing themselves fully, without the comfort of self-deception, without the anesthetic of performance, without the protective distance of living in your own head rather than your own life. And from that ease, from that groundedness, from that accumulated interior weight, you begin to win. Not always, not in every small transaction, but in the dimensions that matter, in the quality of your relationships, in the alignment between what you want and what you do, in the absence of the quiet, corrosive resentment that accumulates in lives built around pleasing others, in the presence of something that most people, if they were honest, would call joy. But it is a different kind of joy from what is usually meant by that word. Not giddiness, not happiness, a deep, settled, almost grave sense of rightness, of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, being exactly who you are. Amor fati. You came to this video with a question. Maybe you didn't know you were carrying it. Maybe it was buried under the daily noise, under the routines and the obligations and the carefully maintained performances that structure a life. But it was there. Why do the ruthless ones win? And now you know the answer. Or rather, now you have the beginning of the answer, because this is not the kind of understanding that completes itself in a single sitting. This is the kind that opens a door. The ruthless ones win when they actually win, when they win in ways that are real and lasting, and not just the brittle appearance of victory, because they have stopped splitting their energy. They have stopped giving it to the management of others' perceptions of them. They have stopped bleeding through wounds they haven't tended. They have stopped absorbing projections that don't belong to them. They have stopped performing a self they built for survival and forgotten to dismantle. They win because they have become, however imperfectly, however partially, whole. And wholeness is not the same as goodness in the conventional sense. Wholeness includes the shadow. Wholeness includes the capacity for ruthlessness, not as a default, but as an available option. The person who has integrated their capacity for ferocity does not use it constantly, but they carry it, and others feel that they carry it. The person who has no integrated shadow, no reclaimed darkness, no owned capacity for refusal and severity, that person is easy to manipulate, easy to manage, easy to diminish. Not because they are weak in any essential sense, but because they are incomplete. There is an enormous territory of themselves they have ceded, to their upbringing, to their conditioning, to the expectations of others. And in that ceded territory, others can and do establish jurisdiction. Reclaiming that territory is the work, not easy work, not comfortable work, but available work. Yours to do, now. The question is not whether you are capable of this. You are reading these words, which means something in you recognized them. Something in you has been building toward this confrontation for a long time. The recognition is not external to you. The recognition is you. The question is only whether you will act on it, not dramatically, not with a grand gesture, not by becoming a different person overnight, but by beginning. By committing today to 1 degree more honesty with yourself than you had yesterday. By allowing, for 1 moment, the parts of yourself you have been managing and suppressing and apologizing for to simply exist without immediate containment. By sitting with the discomfort of your own depth long enough to discover that the depth does not kill you, that the shadow does not consume you when you face it, that the wound does not destroy you when you stop running from it, that the person on the other side of this confrontation, the person you are capable of being when you stop letting others write the script of your identity, is worth the crossing. They are worth it. You are worth it. Not because you are special in some comfortable, affirming, easily digestible way, because you are real. And real is the rarest thing in a world full of performances. Nietzsche wrote that man is something that must be surpassed, not by someone else, by himself, by you. And the surpassing begins not in the external world, not in the achievement of status or the accumulation of power over others, but in the interior. In the confrontation with the self you have been carrying, the shadow you have been hiding, the wounds you have been running from, the life you have been postponing. It begins here. It begins now. Not with a shout, not with a declaration, not with the performance of transformation, with a single, quiet, irreversible decision. To stop explaining yourself to people who have no intention of understanding. To stop spending your rarest currency, your attention, on those who would not cross the street to save your life. To stop outsourcing the authority over your own interior to those who have not earned it and never will. To begin the slow, painful, extraordinary process of becoming sovereign, not over others, over yourself. That is the only power that matters. That is the only power that lasts. That is the power the ruthless ones who truly win. Not the cruel ones, not the merely dominant ones, but the genuinely powerful ones. That is the power they have found. And it is waiting for you, in the place you are most afraid to look. If this reached something in you, something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, write in the comments, "I choose sovereignty." Not for me, for the part of you that has been trying to say that for years and has never quite had permission. This is the permission. This is the moment. Don't look away.